In this video, we will learn about kinds of friction. So there are basically three kinds of friction that we have to study. Number one is static friction. So let's understand it with the help of a diagram. In this diagram, you can see that two boys are trying to move this heavy almirah. This almirah is very heavy, and since boys are applying force in this direction, the static force will be applied in the opposite direction. So now, why we call it static? Because this almirah is initially at rest, it is not moving. Therefore, we call it static friction. Now, the reason behind the static friction is that as the voice will increase the force, the frictional force, that is the static friction, it will also increase in the opposite direction. But there will come a point where the force that is applied by these two boys will be more than the static friction, and after some time, like few seconds, this almirah will start moving. This is known as static friction, which was opposing the movement of this almirah initially. So static friction is the force of friction that comes into play when one object tends to move over the surface, but there is no actual motion. Initially, there was no actual motion, even though these two boys were applying force. It will not exist. If these two boys are not applying force on this almirah, there will be no static friction. The static friction will act only once they will start applying force. So let's understand this with the help of an activity. The aim of the activity is to demonstrate the static friction. The required material is a wooden block and a table. Now what you have to do is try sliding this wooden box over the table on the top of the table by applying small push. Initially you have to apply a very less force and you will see that the object will not move due to the force of static friction that is acting in the opposite direction. Try to increase the force slightly. Even then, when you apply a slight higher force compared to the earlier force, it will not move. But eventually, there will come a time when the force that you are applying will overcome the static friction and it will start moving. The wooden block will start moving over the table. So from here, we can conclude that we observe that at this moment, force of static friction is maximum and you have just overcome that limit value of static friction. Hence, we can conclude that static friction is self-adjusting nature. That means if you will increase the force, the static friction will also increase itself. The force required to start the motion of an object from rest position is measure of static friction only. Let's talk about the sliding friction. So earlier you were applying the static friction was there. Once the almirah started moving, a different force will come into act that is known as sliding friction. So sliding friction is the frictional force exerted by a surface on an object when it is actually moving. It is not at rest now. So in the previous example, if initially there was static frictions, once you overcome the static friction, a different friction, that is the sliding friction, will come into act. When we are walking or running, we say that sliding friction is acting on us. Force of sliding friction is measured by force required to keep the object sliding uniformly over the given surface. For a given pair of sliding objects and a surface, the magnitude of sliding friction remains fixed. It is not of self-adjustable nature. But sliding friction is less than the static friction. But remember that the value of the sliding friction is less than, or we can say the magnitude of sliding friction is always less than the static friction. The third one is rolling friction. Nowadays, you must have seen that people prefer using suitcases that have rollers. Why? Because rolling friction, the magnitude of rolling friction is less than the sliding friction. So, rolling friction is the frictional force exerted by a surface on an object that is rolling over the surface. Thus, rolling friction opposes the rolling motion of an object. Sliding friction was opposing the sliding object, but rolling friction will oppose the rolling motion. When we ride a bicycle, actually the tire starts rolling, and the friction that is acting at that point is known as the rolling friction, starts acting on the tires. This friction is due to the ground, or we say the interlocking between the tires and the roughness that is there in the ground. Force of rolling friction is measured by the force required to maintain the rolling motion because rolling friction tries to oppose the rolling motion. It is easier to roll an object, as I told earlier also that why the magnitude of friction, that is rolling friction, is less than the sliding friction. That is the only reason nowadays people prefer using suitcase that have rollers, or we say tires, because rolling friction is less compared to the sliding friction. I hope this topic is clear to you. Thank you.